Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude, Prison USA. We have two guests, Kat Brady, Coordinator of Community Alliance on Prison, and Robert Perkinson, Associate Professor of American Studies here at UHM. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
We're talking about prison and Prison USA, and as we were talking about, no zip code needed, right? So I'd like to ask you, Kat, to further introduce yourself, also in terms of how you came about to work on the prison question, and also Robert, the same thing, you know, how you came about to be interested in this. So Kat, please.
Well, I'm an environmentalist, Ibrahim, and around the mid-90s, I was trying to figure out where all the money was going. And when I went down and to the budget office and read the 3 big red budget books, I found that one budget in the state that's constantly rising is the Department of Public Safety. And that kind of started me on my quest. Who's in prison, what for? And I found out that lots of people, the majority of people are in there for drugs or drug-involved crimes. So then my next step was to see, well, how much drug treatment is there? Not much. And that kind of started me off on really digging into what's going on and how the state is actually spending its money. And I found out that I found an answer I didn't really like, which was that we're incarcerating way too many people.
Yeah, this is amazing. And how about you, Robert, in terms
Similar
of...
story, really. I mean, I was in, 2 things happened to me in the same time period in the mid-90s when I was a college student. And that was really the peak of prison construction in the US. Prisons were growing up faster than Walmarts from coast to coast, and in Hawaii too. Although the prisons weren't going up here, they were setting them up, buying beds in private for-profit facilities all over the continent. And for the first time when I was in college, prison expenditures started to outpace higher education expenditures. I too wanted to figure out what was going on, and yeah, came to kind of similar conclusions that a lot of what was going on contradicted what I always expected as a child. I grew up as the grandchild of kind of progressive white Southerners. There aren't so many white liberals in the state of Mississippi, but my grandparents were 2 of them. And they always led us to expect that Mississippi was becoming more like the rest of the country, that tolerance would prevail over ignorance, and the country would kind of become more merciful, more accepting, more progressive, and kind of the opposite was happening in the 80s and 90s when I was coming of age. And that kind of led me on this prison odyssey, which finally led me to Texas.
And then when you came to Hawaii, you figured out what was going on, similar to what's going on over there, maybe not to the same extent, but similar kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I started this project in grad school. I originally thought I would just look at prisons in the present, but to me it wasn't. The more kind of I read, the more I felt like we couldn't fully understand our own moment standing smack dab in the middle of it, that it helps to kind of step outside of our moment and look at the whole arc of American history in order to cast light on this very exceptional, unique moment in American history and world history. There's no democratic government in world history that has ever incarcerated such a high portion of its population as the United States does. And astonishingly, that has very little to do with crime. So we've made kind of very aggressive and unique political decisions that has resulted in this, colossus that Kat has been fighting heroically against.
And hey, and it made us the 5th. If Hawaii was its own nation, then we would be 5th in the world in incarceration.
Yeah, in fact, we have a table.
We have a chart.
Yeah, or a chart So we could show the chart on the Elmo to show like exactly, and you might want to talk a little bit about
Yes,
that.
the United States leads the world in incarceration. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. So that should be the first thing that makes you go, what's
Right.
going on?
Yeah.
This is a chart of the world incarceration rates, and it shows the United States is the leader with 756 citizens per 100,000 who are incarcerated. Hawaii, fifth in the world at 332
Two, yeah.
per 100,000 citizens.
Wow.
I mean, that is outrageous.
Yeah.
Obviously, Hawaii's number is encapsulated in the US number,
Right.
but I mean, that's outrageous.
Yeah.
That we're fifth in the world, the land of aloha.
Right. Yeah. Also, like we're talking about Prison USA, Texas Stuff. This is the title of your book, Texas Stuff. We will be showing it, presently on the Elmo. And so, why is it that you wrote that book, and what do you mean by Texas Stuff, given Prison USA?
Well, there's a few reasons. Texas is, as much as the rest of the country, has embraced hardline, anti-rehabilitative, merciless penology, and Hawaii among them. Texas has really been the kind of epicenter of prison growth in the United States. It has the largest prison system in the country, now outstripping California, even though California has a third larger population. There are 171,000 people behind bars in Texas, 750,000 under criminal justice supervision, which is about the size of the booming capital of Austin. The conditions, it's kind of just, there's the most people in private prisons, the most in aggregate, 20,000, the most people in supermax lockdown that walls off people from almost all human contact, the most active death chamber, of course, in the nation. It has the highest reported rates of sexual assault. Prisoners are forced to work, but they're not paid even the kind of token wages that some other states dispense. So it's a state, it's distinguished both by its scale and by its severity in the present, although in some ways what attracted me to it for a larger project was figuring out the ways that Texas, unlike Texas is kind of a deep southern state when it comes to imprisonment and crime and punishment, but Texas has, because it's not entirely a deep southern state, and it's had a lot of very interesting reform movements over the course of its history, it kind of perfected this plantation model of discipline in a way that no other southern state did, and thereby legitimated it for export during the backlash against the civil rights movement. So it's both incredibly large, incredibly severe, but also influential. And it's kind of those confluence of factors that made me think Texas is sort of the right place to look to understand what's happened to the country as a whole, not just in criminal justice, but I think in politics generally, because we've seen kind of parallel developments in the way we deal with social welfare policy, tax policy. They kind of fit together as a whole.
And you trace the racism and the slavery, the rise of slavery through the prison system, and those analogies that are so, that people don't want to go near.
Yeah.
So
it's
true.
It's a real riddle for social scientists and historians trying to figure out, why was it for 100 years almost, the U.S. incarcerated about 100 per 100,000 of its population, so 30% as much as Hawaii is incarcerating now. It went up and down with wars and so on, but was pretty stable, and it's about the same in other industrialized democracies. And then, boom, in the late 1960s in the South, in the mid-1970s in the rest of the country, those numbers broke from that historic baseline and started to climb, at first somewhat gradually, but then picked up speed in the 80s, and in the 90s just went nuts.
Yeah.
And has finally started to level off a bit now. And there isn't any agreement among scholars or pundits or anybody else about why that is. And what I felt like is that the rationales on the table were not sufficient to really explain this. And I think it really doesn't have to do with crime. It only partially has to do with media or suburbanization. What it really has to do with, I think, is the same kind of invidious force in American politics that has always governed the big turns, from nullification to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Movement, and that's the kind of schizophrenic and ultimate and often malevolent ways that American politics deals with the concept of race.
Yeah. Like Kat, you are in touch with what's happening also on the continent, and you have read Robert's book. And so how did that grab you, the book, in terms of your particular experience, not only in Hawaii, but also nationally?
Well, you know, Robert's book is really historiography, because he weaves these incredible historical facts. I mean, it's just, he's got like hundreds of pages of notes. I mean, everything is completely researched. But he weaves that with letters and anecdotal stories of people who he's met through the years during his research. And to me, to have that anecdotal evidence, that really gives life to the facts, because here he has people who are inside for life who are commenting on things. It's really amazing. And he has a story in there of a woman who says when she was about to be released from prison, the other women got on their knees and begged her, please, please tell our story. Please get our story out. And I thought, wow, this is what happens. I mean,
these are the sort of letters you get now.
These are the letters
Right,
I
yeah.
get. Please help me. You're the only one out there. And you know, you just start to think, why are we so into retributive justice rather than real justice, which is looking at every crime has a set of circumstances,
Right.
and we need to examine those circumstances and look at the big picture. And you know, this whole bit about where the country has gone, mandatory minimums, 3-strike laws, these are all laws that are retributive justice. We're mad at you and we're going to lock you up for a long time because that's what's going to keep the community safe. But 96% of the people are going to come out.
Yeah.
And who's going to be sitting next to your kid on the
Although,
bus?
yeah, these guys are God-fearing people, a lot of them, presumably. But they forget about vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, you know. So that's
true.
Yeah.
another thing, the contradiction right there, you know,
Yes.
the hatred, the racism, etc. What leads me to a couple of things. One, what I liked about, you know, the subtitle of Texas Stuff, The Rise of America's Prison Empire. I mean, you just hit the nail on the head, that one. So why did you say that? I mean, we're talking about history in America, and this has to do with history in America. But the prison empire, you know, what drove you to say that?
I mean, a few things. I mean, one, that the system that the U.S. has built is kind of only comparable to, you know, like the Gulag Archipelago or kind of imperial or totalitarian detention systems in its scope. There's now 2.4 million people who will spend tonight behind bars somewhere in the United States. And along racial lines, it's much more, you know, intense and likely. It used to be that the prison population in the U.S. was about 60% white. Now it's about 70% non-white. So it's huge numbers of people that are cycling through the system. You know, about 800,000 go in every year, about 800,000 come out. So it really is touching a lot more people than it ever did in the past. But the other reason is that when I was writing this book, or starting it, was really at a moment when President Bush, the second President Bush, was kind of taking his approach to criminal justice that he had embodied in Texas as governor, including with many of his same advisors, a kind of disdain for legal niceties, presumption of guilt rather than presumptions of innocence, a faith in kind of unrestrained executive power, a vengeful rather than a rehabilitative approach to criminal justice, a refusal to acknowledge the kind of context or the social factors behind eruptions of violence or terrorism or crime, and a kind of focus only on kind of militarized retribution. And that, to a certain extent, one can overstate it, but this kind of Texas model of crime fighting and law enforcement that dates back to slavery on the one hand and dates back to the ethnic cleansing of the Texas Rangers on the other, there's this kind of historical continuity that I try to draw out in the book, gets exported abroad after 9/11, and a lot of the same abuses and dynamics and arguments that take place in this new detention complex that has been assembled by the United States, from Diego Garcia to Guantanamo to Bagram, and in many other places, can
Not
be
to mention
thought
the
of
black
as,
sites. Yeah.
not to mention, right, all of the sites we don't know about
Yeah.
in Poland and all sorts of other places. Yeah.
So I assume by legal niceties you mean the law.
Exactly. Yeah, what they regard as legal niceties, like the Bill of Rights,
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that.
Well,
or the cornerstone of human rights, the law, the Geneva
Yeah, yeah.
Conventions. What's
That's
Alberto
right.
Gonzalez, who was the declared quaint
Yes.
and urged the president to disregard. Well, he was the same. He was Bush's counsel when Bush was governor of Texas. His job then was to review the dossiers of capital defendants just before they were to be executed, so that the final check in the system of capital punishment is that the executive is supposed to look over the documents
Right.
and make a decision like, was this fair? Did the appellate courts consider everything? And when the Atlantic Monthly went through and looked at these dossiers that Alberto Gonzalez was preparing for Bush to look at, and Bush just looked at them for 10 minutes when he was pumping iron at the gym at the Capitol, they found that he left out all of the arguments of the best arguments of defense attorneys, and basically just kind of regurgitated the prosecutorial briefs. And that's the reason that Texas, probably more than any jurisdiction, has now verifiably and more than once executed innocent people, including one of the people I correspond with in the book,
Yeah.
Cameron Todd Willingham.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that, one disregard for the Constitution,
Yes.
the basis for the law in this country. And this is amazing for someone who swears to defend the Constitution and live by it and all that. But also, I mean, one of the things, why refusal to look into DNA evidence on some kind of technicality that is suspicious or specious kind of thing.
Another kind of unique facet of Texas is its the way prisoners get into the system, not the prison system, which is also uniquely harsh and severe, but also the judicial system. And there are a number of faults throughout it. And Hawaii has its faults too, but Texas's are far worse. I mean, we have these outrageously racially disproportionate and overinflated prison populations, and a pretty good public defender office, and fairly even-handed judges compared to the elected judges who are almost all former prosecutors or victims' rights advocates in Texas. But in Texas, the judges are all elected, for one, and that has meant in the recent election cycles that those who can craft the most vicious kind of attack ads playing to the public's fears on crime have tended to attract the most donations and get elected. And this is one of the reasons why people think that all of these prison beds in America and in Hawaii and Texas are filled with dangerous people, because there are these criminals who populate the headlines and our newscasts, sometimes incredibly scary individuals who haunt our nightmares. But by the statistics, very few of those people are in our prison cells across the country.
Yeah.
Most people who go to prison every year in the United States are convicted of non-violent crimes, so no one was hurt by them at all. But you wouldn't know that from looking at the campaign ads or from the news coverage. But so in Texas, the judges are elected. There's no statewide public defender office. Harris County, the kind of ground zero of the death penalty in America, is only setting up a public defender office now. Instead, the attorneys are appointed by the judges, and they're paid a flat rate, which means that if the more hours they work for their client, the less money they get per hour. So the incentive structure encourages assembly line justice. And then, the check on that is supposed to be the appellate courts, but in the appellate courts in Texas, they tend to wield rubber stamps, not gavels.
So
And that gets to your thing about they've ignored DNA evidence. All these
That's
kinds
right. I mean, I'm going to pursue this in a bit because it's really interesting. Deals with the notion of prison empire too. It seems to me, and the question of profit. But we'll deal with that later. I'm interested now in terms of how this corresponds to what's happening
Hawaii?
right here. Yeah.
Well, our prisons are full of nonviolent offenders.
Yeah.
The Department of Public Safety actually has finished conducting a reclassification of almost 6,000 people who are incarcerated by Hawaii. And the preliminary study said that 84% of the women and 63% of the men are nonviolent.
Yeah.
So here, prisons are violent places.
Yeah.
So what happens when you put nonviolent people in a violent place?
I'm gonna project this thing from my laptop on the screen. That's male incarcerated population in Hawaii, and I would like you to comment on it.
So this is from the preliminary reclassification study, and it shows that 23% of the men are community custody, which by the department's own definition means that they could be in a community program, little to no supervision.
Yeah. So this is this one.
Yes, that's the blue.
23.
And then right under that is
The red.
is the minimum custody. Minimum and community are the lowest, least restrictive levels of incarceration.
Or should be.
Well,
Yeah. I mean, but they could be out in the community altogether, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Instead of,
Yes.
Instead of
Right.
being behind bars.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And that has been our point, that, we're incarcerating all these people who are nonviolent in a violent place, where prisons make people be manipulative because every time the shift changes, the laws change, when new ACOs come on for their shift. So there's no consistency. And when there's no consistency, people learn how to meet their needs, and that's called manipulation,
Right.
right? So we actually encourage that by not having a very consistent system of rules that people know these are the rules, this is how it works, because every time the shift changes, the rules change.
Yeah.
So that's a problem.
So you have like 36% medium. Well, give me an example of medium.
Medium, basic, well, let me first explain about custody levels.
Right.
Custody levels are not about the crime that you have been sent to prison for. They're about your institutional behavior. So there are people who are in prison for murder who are minimum custody because they are model prisoners. And actually, one of the consultants who did the reclassification study said, she ran a supermax prison in South Carolina, and she said that murderers were probably the easiest inmates because, well, Hawaii doesn't really have serial murderers, but most murderers, it's a one-shot deal, and it many times crime of passion. So they come into prison and they generally follow the rules. The people who are so that's what custody is. It's the people it's your institutional behavior. And there are 5 levels of custody. The lowest being community custody, which means you have 2 years or less on your sentence. You've completed all your programming. You're basically waiting to be released. Then there's minimum custody, which is you have, I think, 3 or 4 years on your sentence, but you've been a model prisoner. You've done all your programming, you've obeyed the rules, no write-ups. Then the next level is medium custody. That's generally what a lot of people come in at, medium. And that's for people that's the majority of our population is medium custody. And then maximum custody are people who are harder inmates, harder to, more write-ups, things like that. Closed custody is for people who really can't live in the general population because they're either too violent or predatory.
Yeah, I'm looking at the male incarceration population in Hawaii. That's one. But also I'm looking at the female incarceration population in Hawaii. I mean, we can project it now on the screen.
Well, we are we have the fastest rising female prison population
Yeah.
in the nation.
Yeah.
We're twice the national average.
Right. It's interesting, like 48%
Our community
of
custody.
female are community custody.
Yeah.
So this is like, these shouldn't be in there or be in there for a week or something.
Yeah, we've had this tremendous
Yeah.
explosion of incarceration
Yeah.
for women. I mean, they still
Yes.
constitute a relatively small minority of the total prison population, but they're even more disproportionately in for drug crimes,
Yes.
for almost all in for nonviolent crimes. And it's big numbers now, 200,000 women incarcerated in the U.S. That's more than the total U.S. prison
Yeah.
population half a century ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
For women and men.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but here, just like in Hawaii, I mean, if it's this bad in Hawaii, I can imagine how it is elsewhere, especially in Texas. I don't know. I mean, you can talk about that perhaps. But the interesting thing, I want to show another thing. Like these are graphs that gives us some idea about the prison industrial complex, as someone put
Yes,
it.
and why
and
higher
this
education is suffering.
Right. Well, I mean, here we have a problem in Hawaii in terms of shipping prisoners or
Yes.
inmates. Okay, so here Hawaii incarcerated and shipped to U.S. prisons. Okay, so that's. Could you comment on this, Kat?
Yeah, in 1970 we had about 300 people in prison. And then, as Robert said, during the 90s, we had this incredible prison boom. And Hawaii was put under a consent decree with the Department of Justice for overcrowding. And this happened because there was a huge overcrowding problem, 3 or 4 people to a cell, people sleeping with their heads right up to the, bumping on the toilet in the cell. It was just really horrendous. And the Department of Justice came in and said, we're going to take over the prison your system unless you figure this out. So in 1995, we shipped our first 300 men to Texas, to a prison in Texas, a private prison, the Bobby Ross prison. And they were shipped out in the middle of the night, right before New Year's. No families, nobody knew, and they were whisked off from the airport, sent to Texas, and that started Hawaii's incredible prison tour. The men went to Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma, back to Arizona. The women went to Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kentucky, and now they're back. And it's all been to private prisons, and that has been expensive, and it has not paid off for us.
And now they built this kind of super prison in the desert of Arizona, which has kind of perversely become an outer island.
Yes, it's a prison built for Hawaii in the Sonoran Desert. It's built by Corrections Corporation of America. It's called Saguaro, and it's right across. It's actually in the town of Eloy, which is interesting because Eloy, I haven't really found the town. It's a desert with lots of prisons in it, detention centers, all built by CCA. So our men are in Saguaro, and some of the men are in Red Rock, which is right across the street.
So they expect business to boom. I mean, like Hawaii to provide them more people.
They're counting on all sorts of other states, but they're also realizing that there's a backlash where people are saying, wait a minute, isn't it important, visitation, connection with families? So if we send people thousands of miles away, how can their families visit? Is that a good idea? So now they're sort of looking at what we're calling crimigration. So it's all these detention centers. And when you're driving through the desert and you make the turn onto East Arica Road, where the CCA prisons are, first you come upon this big, ugly gray building, and that's the Federal Detention Center for immigrants. Then there's Red Rock Prison, and there are all these big gray buildings with long, slitty windows. And then across the street from Red Rock is Saguaro, and now they built a 3,000-bed prison across the street from Saguaro for California inmates.
Like there's this other graph, Department of Public Safety budget, in dollars, of course.
Oh, yeah.
And then contracts for prison beds outside Hawaii.
Yeah, and
so
let
in
me
dollars.
explain this because From 2000, in the last decade, from 2000 to 2009, Hawaii's public safety's budget, the Department of Public Safety, which runs our prisons and jails, rose 87%. The budget for out-of-town beds, which is contract prison beds, rose 192%. And this is when education is, challenged, and we're shipping money out of state
And it's really
like we've got plenty.
Yeah, yeah.
true across the country. Like the Pew Center on the States looked at state budgets over the last 20 years, and criminal justice is the only area that is growing during this whole period of kind of anti-tax fervor, and that has meant that as this one sector of government has expanded, other sectors have had to give. So the kind of ways that government might help people, education, preventing child abuse, and actually can prevent crime more effectively than locking up, say marijuana offenders, have all been constricted, are now being cut back kind of pretty brutally in Hawaii, which now has the shortest school year in the nation.
Yeah, 167 days.
But we haven't seen any kind of those. We're beginning to see people talking about restricting the prison population, but we haven't seen the steps taken to really make that happen yet.
Yeah, Hawaii's lowered it by like 1%.
Yeah.
But, it's a start.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk more about what happened in this legislative session in Hawaii, about the prison stuff. But I want to go back to Texas stuff, and we talked a little bit about the history and so forth. But I want to show some images and tell me the significance of those in terms of that particular history and relationship to prophets and the empire and so forth. So let me see if I can. Okay, so this one, for instance.
Well, Texas, in the north, the penal traditions were really reformatory in their conceptualization, even if not practice. So the first penitentiaries were set up to kind of hold people, make them penitent, and turn them into better people. In the South, after emancipation, after the end of slavery, prisons were really set up to exploit the labor of former slaves who were convicted in huge numbers in the kind of country's first prison boom of petty offenses, and as a way to kind of reestablish white supremacy and white order. That finally culminated in the formation of Jim Crow after the collapse of Reconstruction. So we've got, there's a kind of plantation tradition in the South, and that image you showed was one of the oldest prison farms. It's of the Ramsey Farm outside of Houston. It's been continually, it's like an 18,000 acre cotton and sugar plantation. It's been in operation since the 1820s, and there's never been a crop that has been pulled in with wage labor on that 18,000 acre plantation, and it's still active today.
I'm showing now the electric chair. I hope they're not using it still.
They're not.
I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
The cocktail of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, they're doing other brutal things.
Brutal things. Yeah.
Yeah, the death chamber, which is in the same room in Texas now, where the death. Yeah, it's where the electric chair we used is actually more active.
We'll show it.
Was more active than it was. That particular instrument was inaugurated in the 1920s by Governor Pat Neff, who was, it's one of the stories I tell in the book, he was a Klan-backed governor, one of the first who kind of ran on a law and order platform, hand in hand with the Klan, which really represented itself in those days as a organization to defend law and order. And there were five African Americans executed in one night in the 1920s there, but it still has not kept up pace with executions in Texas in the post-Furman period.
I'm going to show this other one. This is like the prison gangs. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, this type of labor where you have kind of unpaid gangs of people working in the fields under the tight supervision of a driver or an overseer or a boss, as the nomenclature has it in the Texas prison system, really disappeared. This was the predominant way of organizing labor in the South, and in other slave societies until emancipation. But it collapsed and disappeared almost entirely in the South immediately and was replaced by sharecropping and tenancy, which were inequitable labor relationships but allowed a lot more autonomy for laborers. It was preserved only in this form of gang labor production, propelled by the whip rather than wages, was preserved only in southern prison plantations in Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and elsewhere. And so therefore, these institutions have kind of preserved the rhythms of daily life, the kind of subcultural characteristics, even the music. A lot of these kind of classic prototypical blues songs recorded by the Lomaxes and so on in the 1920s, these old slave songs that had vanished everywhere else. The folklorists were so fascinated with the prisons because here were these musical forms that would, you know, propel gang labor, pace the work of picking or pace axe chopping around a tree. So in that way, and if you go to Texas prison still, and Louisiana, Mississippi too, it's kind of like stepping into a living history theme park, almost. Like, I don't know if you've ever been to Colonial Williamsburg, but it's kind of like a desanitized version of Colonial Williamsburg. And the first time I pulled up at the gate, I remember watching a gang of almost exclusively African-American convicts, you know, being led out to the fields by an armed white man on horseback, as if it was a kind of Hollywood set or something. But these are, of course, you know, very real lives and people I got to know quite well in many cases. That was in the 90s, but you could go you could go see it today if you wanted to. Less so. I mean, the prison system has grown so big recently that not all of the units are agricultural.
This is like in this photo, for instance, this is one aspect of what you might call Jim Crow entered the prison system. So could you elaborate more on that?
Well, there's two ways that thinking about Jim Crow and incarceration are significant. One is that these southern institutions did become this kind of sites of historic preservation in a perverse way of the lifeways of slavery, and they were segregated until the federal lawsuits of the 1980s, and that gave them a kind of added edge of severity that when rehabilitation collapsed and as the right returned to power from Nixon's election forward, became a kind of tough southern template that gets exported to the country and that people like Peter Carlisle are trying to export to Hawaii with some success. There's a broader political sense too over the arc of American history, and that what I found is looking at the ways that Reconstruction collapsed. You know, there was this moment in American history after emancipation that I talk about in the book when African Americans were building schools, getting elected to higher office, integrating public transportation, and then they were driven back towards slavery by what was the most sustained and successful campaign of terrorism in American history, as historians have finally kind of started to acknowledge it with the language that it deserves. So there was this kind of step forward and this step back. And what that clarified for me was a way of thinking about mass imprisonment also as another paradigmatic retreat from freedom in American history. There was this tremendous flourishing, outpouring of optimism and hope and real progress in dismantling Jim Crow segregation that had deferred the promises of emancipation and the Civil War for a century.
You know, and Kat, you can jump in here because you know the history. That retreat from freedom, the freedom that was, you know, after the Civil War, etc., was for a fleeting moment. But the powers that be didn't want the former slaves and the poor whites to come together, and you know, then the whole thing about race being an organizing principle in American society would not be working for U.S. empire, whether in terms of expansion in the continent or elsewhere in the world. So you might want to...
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that Robert points out in his book is that between, I think it was 85 and 95, the increase in the prison population for violent offenders was 86%. And in that same 10 years, for nonviolent offenders, 478% increase in prison beds. What does that tell you? it should be difficult to take away somebody's liberty. It shouldn't be easy. And when
it tells you it's not, this prison growth is not about dangerousness to the
Yes.
public, right?
Right.
It's not about
That's
crime.
right.
it's about spin. It's about retribution. It's about, to me, for want of a better statement, creating a master race. And people who don't fit into that profile, they're just sent away because they're not part of that.
And as we mentioned, like cheap labor and all that,
Yes.
right? I mean, so that's very important because this is the notion of empire, and also like how to repress and suppress a population, or populations, in fact. You know,
And you see this in the archives. If you go and look at the debates over desegregation in Congress or in state legislatures in the 50s as the civil rights movement was in full flourish, the segregationists are saying that if we have integration of the races, Strom Thurmond famously said, there'll be a wave of terror and crime that will sweep the country. And as those segregationists were defeated on civil rights because of the actions of people on the streets, the courts, the Congress, everywhere else, they kind of re-legitimated themselves by turning to criminal justice, and they sought to impose order upon this new society that they had feared and fought against. So in the same legislative sessions that segregationist statutes are being swept from the books, in Texas and elsewhere, you're seeing sentencing enhancements, adult sentencing for juveniles, parole curtailments, mandatory minimum sentencing, such that the jurisdictions in the U.S. that fought against desegregation most vociferously have become the nation's most vigorous jailers. Now that kind of tells it, to get back to your empire question, that kind of tells a story in black and white of how, as a country, the United States, I think, has come, how racial politics, conscious, subconscious, intended and not, in all sorts of very complicated ways, how race has helped build a prison empire in the United States. Now, in certain jurisdictions, in Hawaii especially, there's a kind of parallel but distinct history of colonialism that has, not slavery, that has also generated these huge numbers of Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders who are incarcerated.
That's
and
a
of
good
course now
point,
they're
yeah.
being banished, from their homelands and sent off to this kind of desert kind of Bantustan for indigenous people.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's a kind of ethnic cleansing in a
Right.
in a really troubling way.
No,
Yes.
that's right,
Yeah.
and it happens all over, including in
Yeah.
Hawaii. So could you comment a bit more on that, and
Sure.
also what have you been doing of late, especially in terms of this,
Fix this problem.
session? No, this
I'm
session
working
of the
on it.
legislature.
Well,
So
yeah.
She's
you're
working
doing
on it
some
and
good
with a lot of
stuff.
success, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the Pew Center on the States did a study, and this was so astounding. When I say this to people, they say, "Oh, that can't be true." 1 in 32 people in Hawaii is under some form of correctional supervision. So they're either incarcerated, they're on probation, or they are on parole.
And their freedom as citizens is significantly
Yeah.
restricted.
Right.
under all of
Curtailed.
these.
Is
Right.
that
Arrangements,
incredible?
right.
1 in
1 in
32.
That's
So
huge.
when you look up the stats about Native Hawaiians who are incarcerated, the department likes to say about 40%. Anybody who walks into prison knows that that is not true. It is way closer, 60, 70% of the people in prison are Native Hawaiians. I think it is a form of ethnic cleansing by banishing people to a place that is completely foreign. I mean, they could have sent people to the moon. I mean, it's the desert
Kinda
is
looks like the
just,
moon.
there's nothing that can grow there. Hard-packed dirt, gray walls. It's really, there's nothing that even reminds people of home.
Yeah.
So it's really, you're disconnecting people. And then what they did when they built that prison is that they actually took men from 3 separate prisons and put them in one prison. And each of those prisons had a gang. So what they did in their wisdom was create one prison and put all 3 gangs together.
Yeah.
What a good idea.
Yeah. Let them kill each other.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much logic about what's going on. I'm happy to say, though, that the legislature, for the first time, and I've been doing this about 15 years, for the first time we actually have a chair of the Senate Public Safety Committee and a chair of the House Public Safety Committee who actually get it. They know that what we're doing is not good.
Who are they?
And in the Senate, we have Senator Willis Sparrow, and in the House, it's Representative Faye Hanohano. And what's interesting about Faye Hanohano is that Rep. Hanohano was an ACO, Adult Correctional Officer at Kulani Prison, which was recently closed with little to no explanation. So she really knows the inside workings of the department, and she has been very, very helpful. They both have been really wonderful. And this year, we managed in this horrendous year where hardly anybody walked away happy, we got a bill passed that the department must disclose by a report to the legislature every year the number of prison rapes or sex assaults, which has been a really well-guarded secret. Number two, we passed a bill on cultural interventions and cognitive restructuring. We're actually acknowledging that Hawaiian interventions, that cultural interventions actually resonate with our people more than programs from Kansas.
Yeah.
So that's good. And then for years we've been fighting to get an audit done of the private prison beds. You know, is this something that's working for us or is it not?
Yeah.
And right now we got a bill passed and it has some money. And the other thing I'm and we also didn't close one module of Halava, which was a great victory. And the other thing I'm working on is justice for all people of Hawaii. And if you would like to appear in a book that supports civil unions and justice for all, please go to www.equality808.com. You can send your picture. I sent in my picture because justice is where it's at, and everybody should be treated equally, and we think every family should have the same rights.
Yeah. I mean, but in a sense, it's baffling, but not really if you know the way politics works, but still baffling in terms of like the U.S. Constitution, etc. When you violate not only prisoners' rights, but also their children and family, etc. I mean, this is like really, terrible. And in terms of rehabilitation, it's anti-rehabilitation. So you look at that person as a pawn, let's say, that has a certain price and that could generate a certain kind of profit and would save us money, you know. So that's a problem, yeah.
And it so happens that the people who are deemed expendable in this correctional apparatus that no longer corrects, that the country has built, are the descendants of those who, you know, built the country or who had their lands stolen.
Yes.
And the descendants of those who suffered under Jim Crow. And we've seen, and the racial disparities are so stark now that we've seen kind of significant rollbacks of the civil rights movement. I mean, there's 1.5 million African Americans who've been deprived the right to vote. That played a bigger role in the Florida debacle of 2000 than hanging Chads.
Right.
You know, 1 in 9 African American kids goes to bed every night with a parent in prison. For African American men who don't graduate from high school, 60% of them can expect to spend time in prison during their lifetime. So there's really a whole generation of African Americans, mainly on the continent, to a lesser extent Latinos and Hawaiians, mainly in Hawaii, Marshallese and others also, who are kind of being cast to the wolves and relegated to a kind of permanent underclass, because not only are they incarcerated, again, realize mostly for nonviolent offenses. So you don't have to be sympathetic to baby murderers and so on in order to think that our prison system needs to be hugely downsized. But not only are they in disproportionate numbers, which are worse now than they were at the height of segregation, unbelievably, but they can be discriminated against in the free world in all sorts of ways once they get out. So if you have a felony conviction, you're barred for life from public housing, you're barred from food stamps, you're barred from financial aid for college, you're barred from jury service, often barred from voting. And this is all lawful discrimination. Many of the same forms of discrimination that their grandparents were subject to under Jim Crow. And for that reason, you know, Michelle Alexander, a law professor who's written a new book which has kind of similar arguments to mine, calls the prison system the new Jim Crow. And in Hawaii, it's a serious kind of new manifestation of colonialism in the islands. You know, in order to, most of our crime in Hawaii is property crime. A lot of it is property crime against tourists.
Right.
So kind of prioritizing the experience of the visitor above the indigenous inhabitant.
So I was gonna say, I just have to interject here.
Yeah.
Like cruel and unusual punishment becomes still cruel, but becomes usual. Like I mean, that's the norm. You know, that's
Right.
it's mind-boggling. I mean, baffling in terms of somebody who swears to defend the Constitution. I mean, this is just. So, what's the relationship between the crisis that is upon us now, and you know that we're in it now, and hopes for kind of trying to ameliorate the problem?
Well, you know what's interesting? Texas, with its horrible history, has actually assumed the leading role in prison reform these days. So that should give us all hope, because here's a place that, you know, as Robert likes to say, all roads led to Texas when you're looking at how did we get into this incredible mess. And now we can look to Texas and say, wow, this is a place that actually is trying to do the right thing now, and they're coming up with some reforms that we're pushing in Hawaii as well.
But prisons are still privatized, and they're doing the reforms within a privatized system.
Well,
is it or what?
I mean, Hawaii actually has a greater percentage of its inmates in private facilities than does Texas. Texas has greater aggregate numbers in private facilities. These reforms Kat is talking about are mainly not reforms within the carceral apparatus itself. They're mainly in the entry and exit points.
Okay.
And there's a kind of facsimile of Kat in Texas named Ana Yanez Correa, who's a tremendous, inspiring, wonderful woman who also is leading the charge, along with many, many other allies in different communities and different constituencies. And they have also found that for the first time in 2 generations, the legislature is willing to listen to some common sense on criminal justice, partially because we've created this bloated criminal justice monster that's devouring $212 billion a year and paying very few dividends in terms of public safety. So it's like an out of control entitlement program that doesn't actually serve anyone's interest. On the other hand,
Well, it serves the prosecutor's interest because we're
they
making
get
more
elected.
criminals.
And so, yeah.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, we've seen the prison, because of these reforms, probation reforms in Texas mainly, we've seen the prison population level off, even decline a little. But, you know, after 40 years in every legislative session of creating laws to send more people to prison, it's going to take a long time to undo all of that.
If you want to like save money, etc., I mean that would be okay. I mean that would help. But the idea is to get rid of those ethos, like you talk Texas stuff as ethos that drive that kind of system.
Yeah, I don't think that's happened yet.
Yeah, no, that's the idea.
We're
I
not
mean
there yet.
that's when we would be really talking about genuine kind of reform. Right? I mean, you know, change the paradigm, you know, paradigm shift, etc.
And that's tough.
And then you have to write another book called Texas Untough or something.
Texas used to be tough. That would be nice if we could have a Hawaii.
Texas hugs.
Hawaii actually is the land of aloha. That's my goal.
Right, yeah, okay. So, I mean, but this has to do with larger political economy and the politics. I mean, really.
Yes.
I mean, that's what we're
Yes.
talking about.
Yeah.
So it requires a broader social movement than just simply prison reform kind of movement. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think
Yes.
that's exactly right. I mean, you know,
Yes.
it took an epic freedom movement it took a civil war to dismantle
Right,
slavery.
right.
It took an epic freedom movement to dislodge Jim Crow segregation, and it's probably going to take another one
Yeah.
to get smart on criminal justice.
Right, and
Yeah.
and then I'm thinking about like retreat from freedom, as you put it earlier, from the Civil War. I think in terms there were 2 moments in history in America where retreat from freedom occurred. One, the Civil War, you know, and after the Reconstruction and stuff. The other one is civil rights movement.
After the civil rights movement.
Yeah,
that's
after the
point
civil
that's
rights
the main
movement.
point of the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Because this is, I mean, really critical. I mean, this leads to why, for instance, Martin Luther King has been assassinated, as some people might think, because he wanted to go beyond what was permitted given the emancipation and so forth, going working class, blue collar kind of
But
stuff.
yeah, of course, it's much bigger than just
Yeah.
any individual. But we have seen this shift from the kind of hope of the great society, kind of bringing real social democracy and positive rights, not just negative rights, to the American citizenry. And we at the same time we've seen this massive increase in the apparatus of incarceration. We've also seen kind of strangulation of education. We've seen, in real dollar terms, all of the social welfare benefits cut off. We're finally now, 40 years afterwards, beginning to see some reforms in healthcare, but we've seen the evolution of a much meaner society, generally speaking, across the board, from unregulated high finance to our policy toward the homeless.
Yeah,
and
that's
education
right.
to
You're talking about,
incarceration.
for instance, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, maybe others as well. But it's interesting, Arizona is in the news. They want to incarcerate even more people, but in the sense that they're trying to defend the country for homeland security purposes and all that kind of
this
stuff.
is one of the most disturbing developments, is that just that it seems like we're getting some common sense after 40 years of madness, legislating by fear and headline and demagoguery and criminal justice across the country. Just at that moment, from the mid-1990s forward, we're seeing this tremendous ramp up in immigration detention and a whole new wave of racially coded demagoguery, exemplified most starkly in Arizona, that's passed really what amounts to a kind of hate legislation and a kind of encouragement to law enforcement to begin detaining
Profiling.
people who
everybody.
speak Spanish or look Latino in mass numbers.
Yeah, it's interesting, like someone like John McCain becomes like the voice of reason.
Right. Or Billy Hutchinson, who's
Yeah,
hard as a socialist.
I mean,
in, Texas.
give me a break. I mean, that shows you the social movements on the right. I mean, you were talking Tea Party and all that kind of stuff, but this is very important,
And you really see, I think you can understand the Tea Party and the racial and ideological homogeneity and the discipline of the Republican Party. You can really see its origins in the partisan realignment that took place in the aftermath of civil rights, when Barry Goldwater, taking a cue from George Wallace, figured out, hey, we can bust up the Democrats' New Deal coalition by talking tough on crime.
Southern
and
strategy.
law enforcement. And that's the
yeah.
Southern strategy that created the
right.
modern Republican Party that is.
And led to Bush 1 with the Willie Horton kind
Exactly.
of
Yes.
thing.
Right.
So this
So
is
it's entwined.
absolutely. I mean, this is like kind of disturbing that, but it predated those kinds of Southern strategy, because the paradigm was there. It was just a matter of figuring out, well, what is the proper moment? What's the opportune moment to really jump at it and expand, those kinds of things. Any final thoughts? We have just like maybe we're going to wrap it up. Okay, I'm sorry.
I just want to
we got to wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Equality808.com. Send your picture.
It is a hopeful moment.
Okay, great. And see you next month. Aloha.